The first words she ever spoke in that grand kitchen were drowned out by laughter, not hers, but the cold, careless laughter of a room full of strangers. "Bet she can't even read the menu in English," one of them sneered, the millionaire's closest friends smirking behind their crystal glasses. Then, a heavy silence settled, thick and suffocating. No one looked at her. No one asked what she thought. And in that silence, her soul trembled in pain. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you've cooked dinner for someone who never says thank you, or washed dishes while everyone else sleeps, hiding your exhaustion beneath quiet dignity. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will move you. In the heart of Manhattan, where the glass towers pierce the sky like gleaming needles and the ceaseless symphony of car horns echoes between concrete walls, stood Sterling Manor, a limestone palace that commanded respect from every passerby. Its windows reflected the afternoon sun like mirrors of gold, and inside, Italian marble floors stretched beneath Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries. The walls displayed original Picassos and Monets, while a state-of-the-art sound system whispered jazz melodies through every room. Richard Sterling had built this empire through decades of ruthless real estate investments, his portfolio spanning from luxury condos in Soho to commercial properties across 5 boroughs. His net worth had climbed beyond $40 million, with additional assets diversified in cryptocurrency and international bonds. Yet, for all its grandeur, the mansion felt as cold as a mausoleum. At 4:30 every morning, while the city still slept beneath a blanket of darkness, Maria Gonzalez would slip her key into the service entrance of Sterling Manor. Her footsteps, soft as whispered prayers, would carry her through the servants' hallway toward the kitchen, a cathedral of stainless steel and imported countertops that could have fed an entire neighborhood. Maria had been born in the Bronx, the daughter of a seamstress and a mechanic, raised in a cramped apartment where the aroma of her abuela's rice and beans could make anyone forget their troubles. She had learned to cook not from culinary school, but from watching her grandmother's weathered hands transform simple ingredients into miracles. By the time she turned 20, Maria could make a chicken stretch to feed 8 people, and her sofrito could bring tears of joy to the hardest heart. She had arrived at Sterling Manor 15 years ago, carrying nothing but a worn leather portfolio filled with handwritten recipes and a letter of recommendation from her previous employer, a kind woman who had recognized Maria's gift and whispered her name to Richard Sterling's head of staff. Maria still remembered her first day, how her hands had trembled as she stood in that pristine kitchen, overwhelmed by gadgets she'd never seen before. But within hours, she had found her rhythm. The Viking stove became her altar, the copper pots her instruments, and every morning she would begin her sacred ritual of nourishing this cold, beautiful house. Before dawn broke over Central Park, Maria would have already prepared fresh bread for the Sterling family's breakfast table. Her hands, marked by decades of small burns and cuts, moved with practiced grace as she kneaded dough that would rise like hope itself. The aroma of yeast and flour would drift through the mansion's halls, the first sign of life in an otherwise sterile environment. She would then turn her attention to the day's meals, perhaps a delicate fish stew that whispered of ocean breezes, or a slow braised lamb that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Every dish was prepared with the kind of attention that only comes from understanding that food is love made visible. In those early years, the Sterling children, Emma and Michael, would race down the marble staircase each morning, drawn by the smell of Maria's cooking like moths to flame. Emma, with her wild curls and curious eyes, would climb onto a stool beside the massive island, watching Maria's every movement with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. Michael, 2 years older and already showing signs of his father's reserved nature, would nonetheless linger by the kitchen doorway, drawn by the warmth that seemed to emanate from Maria's presence. She would slip them pieces of warm bread slathered with butter and honey, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she watched them savor each bite. Those moments felt like stolen treasures in a house where tenderness was as rare as snow in July. But as the children grew older and Richard's business empire expanded, the warmth began to fade. Richard Sterling had built his fortune by viewing everything as an investment opportunity, analyzing potential returns with the cold precision of a computer algorithm. His real estate portfolio had grown to include high-end properties from Manhattan to Miami, and his stock market investments had weathered multiple economic storms. He kept portions of his wealth in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, always staying ahead of market trends. Money flowed through his life like water through a sieve, always abundant, never appreciated. The mansion staff knew he could afford to hire any chef from any Michelin-starred restaurant in the world, yet Maria had remained invisible and indispensable, the beating heart of a house that had forgotten how to feel. Richard's wife, Catherine, had come from old money, the kind of inherited wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Her family's assets stretched back generations, built on railroad fortunes and oil investments that had compound interest working in their favor for over a century. She moved through the mansion like a swan gliding across still water, beautiful and untouchable. To Catherine, Maria was merely part of the household machinery, necessary but unremarkable, like the Italian marble floors or the imported crystal chandeliers. She never bothered to learn the name of the woman who prepared her meals, referring to her simply as the cook in conversations with her society friends. The kitchen became Maria's sanctuary and her prison. Each morning she would arrive to find notes left by Catherine, crisp instructions written on expensive stationery about dietary preferences for upcoming dinner parties or complaints about the previous evening's meal. The sauce was too thick, one note might read, or, "We'll need something more sophisticated for the Vanderburg dinner." Never a thank you, never a compliment. Maria would read these notes in the pre-dawn stillness, her heart growing a little smaller with each careless criticism. Maria poured her soul into every meal she prepared, infusing each dish with memories of her grandmother's kitchen, with stories passed down through generations of women who understood that cooking was a language of love. When she prepared her special sancocho, she could almost hear her abuela's voice guiding her hands as she added each spice, each vegetable cut with precision born of practice and devotion. The broth would simmer for hours, filling the mansion with an aroma that spoke of home, of family gathered around a table where everyone belonged. But when the Sterling family sat down to eat, Maria would retreat to the servants' quarters, listening to the distant sound of clinking silverware and muffled conversation, knowing that her food was nourishing bodies while her own spirit went unfed. The years accumulated like dust on forgotten furniture. Maria watched Emma grow from a curious child into a reserved teenager who spent more time with her phone than in the kitchen. Michael left for boarding school, then college, returning only for holidays when he would nod politely at Maria before disappearing into his childhood room. Richard grew more distant, more consumed with his business empire that now included international properties and complex financial instruments that required constant attention. He would eat Maria's carefully prepared meals while scrolling through stock reports on his tablet, never tasting, never savoring, never acknowledging the woman whose hands had created the feast before him. One particular evening stood out like a scar on Maria's memory. Richard was hosting a dinner party for potential investors in his new cryptocurrency venture, men with sharp suits and sharper tongues who spoke of money the way other people discuss the weather. Maria had spent 3 days preparing for the event, crafting a menu that would showcase her skills while appealing to their sophisticated palates. She had prepared a delicate ceviche with fish so fresh it seemed to taste of ocean spray, followed by lamb that had been slow roasted with herbs she had grown herself in small pots on the kitchen windowsill. The dessert was her masterpiece, a tres leches cake that had been her grandmother's secret recipe, each layer infused with memories and love. As the guests arrived, Maria had hoped for just a moment of recognition, perhaps a word of appreciation for the feast she had created. Instead, she heard laughter drifting from the dining room, followed by words that cut through her like broken glass. "Sterling, where did you find your cook?" one man asked with barely concealed amusement. "I heard she doesn't even have formal training. Probably learned everything from YouTube videos." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, and Maria felt her cheeks burn with shame as she stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. But it was Richard's response that wounded her most deeply. Instead of defending the woman who had nourished his family for over a decade, he simply shrugged with indifference. "She's adequate for day-to-day cooking," he said, his voice carrying no warmth, no appreciation. "Though I've been considering upgrading to someone with proper credentials, these days you need a chef with real pedigree if you want to make an impression." The words hit Maria like physical blows, each one diminishing her worth, reducing years of dedication to mere adequacy. That night, Maria sat in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror above her dresser. Her hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn for 15 years. Her hands, mapped with lines and scars from countless hours in the kitchen, rested in her lap like tired birds. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that food prepared with love could heal wounds and mend hearts. But what happened when the love went unrecognized, when dedication was met with dismissal, when the very essence of who you were was deemed inadequate by those you served? The seasons changed, and with them came small cruelties that accumulated like pebbles in Maria's shoes. Catherine would invite friends for lunch and speak about her as if she weren't standing just steps away. "The help these days," she would sigh dramatically. "They simply don't understand refinement. Everything is so ethnic." The word dripped from her lips like poison, and Maria would continue chopping vegetables with steady hands while her heart cracked a little more. Richard's business associates would sometimes wander into the kitchen during parties, helping themselves to hors d'oeuvres while making jokes about authentic Mexican cuisine in voices loud enough for Maria to hear. They never seemed to remember that she was Puerto Rican, or perhaps they simply didn't care to make the distinction. But even in this climate of casual cruelty, there remained one bright spot that kept Maria's spirit from completely withering. Emma, now 13, had begun spending time in the kitchen again, drawn perhaps by some instinct to find warmth in a house that grew colder by the day. She would arrive home from her exclusive private school in the afternoons, dropping her designer backpack by the kitchen door and settling onto the familiar stool beside the island. Her questions had grown more sophisticated over the years. She wanted to understand not just how to cook, but why certain combinations of flavors worked, what made some dishes comfort food while others felt like celebrations. Maria found herself sharing more than recipes during these afternoon sessions. She spoke about her childhood in the Bronx, about her grandmother who could make magic with nothing but rice, beans, and leftover chicken. She told Emma about the importance of tasting as you cook, of adjusting seasonings not just with your palate, but with your heart. "Real cooking," Maria would tell her as they worked together, flour dusting their hands and steam rising from the stove, "isn't about following rules. It's about understanding your ingredients, respecting them, and letting them tell their own story." Emma absorbed these lessons like earth receiving rain after a drought. She learned to distinguish between the sharp bite of fresh garlic and the mellow sweetness of garlic that had been slowly sautéed until golden. She discovered that salt didn't just make food taste saltier, but brought out flavors that were already hiding in the ingredients, waiting to be awakened. Most importantly, she began to understand that the woman everyone else saw as merely the cook was actually an artist, a keeper of traditions, a bridge between generations of knowledge and love. These kitchen sessions became their secret world, a place where the rules of the Sterling household didn't apply. Emma would tell Maria about her day at school, about friendships and fears that she couldn't share with her distant parents. Maria would listen with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes the most important conversations happened while hands were busy with simple tasks. Together, they would knead bread, the rhythm of their movements creating a meditation that spoke louder than words. Emma learned that cooking was not just about feeding the body, but about feeding the soul, about creating moments of connection in a world that often felt disconnected and cold. As Emma grew older, she began to see her family's treatment of Maria with increasingly critical eyes. She noticed how her mother would leave curt notes about meal preferences without ever expressing gratitude. She observed how her father would eat Maria's carefully prepared dinners while discussing business deals on his phone, never acknowledging the artistry on his plate. Most painfully, she witnessed the casual dismissal, the way her parents' friends would speak about Maria as if she were invisible, their words carrying the sting of prejudice wrapped in the veneer of superiority. One afternoon, as they prepared empanadas together, Maria teaching Emma the traditional way to fold the dough so that none of the filling would escape during baking, Emma asked a question that had been weighing on her young heart. "Maria, why do you stay here? Why don't you work somewhere where people appreciate what you do?" Her voice was small, almost whispered, as if she were afraid that speaking the truth too loudly might shatter something precious. Maria paused in her work, her hands stilled on the dough she had been shaping. It was a question she had asked herself countless times during sleepless nights, a question that had no easy answer. She could have explained about the steady paycheck that helped support her elderly mother in the Bronx, about the health insurance that had covered her sister's cancer treatments, about the practical considerations that kept her tethered to a job that slowly eroded her sense of worth. Instead, she looked into Emma's earnest face and chose a different truth. "Sometimes, mija," she said softly, using the endearment that felt natural despite the boundaries that were supposed to exist between them. "We stay not because it's easy, but because someone needs us to stay. Your family needs more than just food on the table. They need someone who remembers how to put love into what they create, even when that love isn't recognized. Maybe especially then." She resumed shaping the empanadas, her movements gentle but purposeful. "And you, Emma, you remind me why the work matters. When I see you learning, when I watch you discover that food can be a language of care, that gives meaning to all the rest." But even Emma's presence couldn't shield Maria from the growing tension that permeated Sterling Manor. Richard's business had expanded internationally, his investment portfolio now including properties across Europe and Asia. He had become increasingly obsessed with status symbols, with maintaining an image that reflected his growing wealth and influence. The mansion, already impressive, underwent renovations that added a wine cellar with temperature-controlled storage for bottles worth thousands of dollars each, and a formal dining room that could seat 20 guests beneath a chandelier that had once hung in a European castle. With these changes came a shift in Richard's expectations. The simple, heartfelt meals that had sustained his family for years were no longer deemed sophisticated enough for his elevated status. He began making pointed comments about Maria's cooking, suggesting that perhaps it was time to modernize the kitchen's offerings. Catherine, always attuned to her husband's moods, began echoing these sentiments with increasing fervor. She spoke of friends who had hired chefs trained in French techniques, of the importance of presentation as much as taste, of the need to impress guests with culinary artistry that matched the mansion's grandeur. Maria felt these criticisms like blows to her chest, each one chipping away at the confidence she had built over decades of cooking with love and skill. She tried to adapt, studying online videos of plating techniques and modern cooking methods, but her heart wasn't in these performances. The food looked prettier, perhaps, arranged on the plate like small sculptures, but it had lost something essential: the warmth, the comfort, the sense that someone who cared about your well-being had prepared this meal specifically for you. The breaking point came with the arrival of spring and an announcement that would change everything. Richard had been invited to join an exclusive investment group that specialized in luxury hospitality ventures, high-end restaurants, boutique hotels, and resort properties that catered to the ultra-wealthy. It was the kind of opportunity that could double his net worth within 5 years, but it came with expectations. The other investors were men who owned restaurants with Michelin stars, who could discuss the nuances of molecular gastronomy with the same fluency that Richard analyzed real estate markets. They would be hosting dinners at each other's homes, showcasing not just their wealth but their sophisticated palates and cultural refinement. "We need to upgrade," Richard announced one morning as Maria was preparing his usual breakfast. Eggs perfectly over easy, toast golden brown, coffee black and strong. He wasn't speaking to her directly, but to Catherine, though his words were clearly meant for Maria's ears as well. "The Worthington dinner is next month, and then we're hosting the August gathering. We can't serve home cooking to people who dine at Le Bernardin every week." Catherine nodded enthusiastically, already envisioning the social opportunities that would come with this new alliance. "I've been researching chefs," she said, pulling out her tablet to show Richard photos of young culinary artists who had trained in renowned restaurants across Europe. "This one studied under Gordon Ramsay, and this one has a James Beard nomination. They understand presentation, molecular techniques, wine pairings." Maria continued preparing breakfast, her movements automatic even as her heart sank. She had known this day would come eventually, had seen the writing on the wall as Richard's world grew more rarefied and demanding. But knowing hadn't made it easier to hear, hadn't prepared her for the casual way her 15 years of service were being dismissed as inadequate for the family's elevated station. The week that followed felt like a slow funeral for everything Maria had built in Sterling Manor. She continued her duties with the same dedication she had always shown, but there was a heaviness in her movements, a sadness that seasoned everything she prepared. Emma noticed immediately, her young heart attuned to the shift in the kitchen's atmosphere. She began spending even more time with Maria, as if sensing that their time together was coming to an end. "Are you going to leave us?" Emma asked one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper as they worked together on a batch of cookies, a simple pleasure in a house that increasingly valued complexity over comfort. Maria's hands stilled on the cookie dough, and for a moment she couldn't speak around the tightness in her throat. "I don't know, mi amor," she finally managed. "Sometimes the people we care about outgrow their need for us. It doesn't mean what we shared wasn't important, but it means it might be time to find somewhere else to plant our seeds of caring." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and Maria felt her own heart break a little more. This child, who had grown up in her kitchen, who had learned to cook with love rather than technique, who understood that food was a language of care, losing this connection would hurt almost as much as losing her job. But Maria had lived long enough to know that love sometimes meant letting go, even when holding on felt like the only way to keep breathing. Richard hired Chef Laurent Dubois on a Tuesday morning in June, after a formal interview process that involved a tasting menu and discussions about modern culinary trends. Laurent was everything Maria was not: young, formally trained, equipped with knowledge of molecular gastronomy and artistic plating techniques. He had worked in restaurants with Michelin stars, had trained under celebrity chefs whose names appeared on cooking shows and magazine covers. His credentials were impeccable, his presentation flawless, his ability to discuss food in technical terms that impressed Richard's sophisticated palate undeniable. Maria was not fired outright. Richard was too conscious of appearances for such a direct dismissal. Instead, she was reassigned to supporting roles, preparing basic ingredients and handling cleanup, while Laurent created the dishes that would grace the Sterling table. It was a humiliation designed to make her quit rather than force Richard to confront the cruelty of his decision directly. She found herself chopping vegetables for stocks that Laurent would claim credit for, washing dishes that had held food she had partially prepared but would never be recognized for creating. Laurent, to his credit, was not intentionally cruel. He was simply focused on his own success, on impressing his new employer with culinary creations that showcased his training and artistic vision. He barely noticed Maria in those first weeks, seeing her as part of the kitchen infrastructure rather than as a fellow human being with feelings and pride. When he did acknowledge her presence, it was with the casual indifference of someone accustomed to working with kitchen staff who were meant to support rather than collaborate. The transformation of Sterling Manor's cuisine was immediate and dramatic. Where Maria's meals had been warm and comforting, Laurent's creations were architectural marvels that challenged the palate with unexpected combinations and artistic presentations. Dinner plates became canvases for edible sculptures that looked more like museum installations than food meant to nourish and satisfy. Richard was delighted, Catherine was impressed, and their social circle began to take notice of the elevated dining experience available at Sterling Manor. But Emma noticed something else entirely. The soul had gone out of the food. The meals were beautiful to look at and intellectually interesting to discuss, but they didn't satisfy in the way that Maria's cooking had. There was no warmth, no sense of being cared for, no feeling that the person who had prepared this food had thought about the people who would eat it with anything more than professional competence. The kitchen, once filled with the comfortable sounds of simmering pots and gentle humming, now buzzed with the efficiency of a commercial restaurant, clinical, precise, and emotionally cold. Maria endured this new reality with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her years of service. She arrived at the same early hour, performed her assigned tasks with professional competence, and left at the end of each day without complaint or drama. But inside, she was withering like a plant kept too long in shade. Her purpose, her identity, her sense of worth had been so closely tied to her role as the heart of the Sterling kitchen that this relegation to supporting player felt like a slow death of everything that mattered to her. The crisis that would ultimately change everything began not with grand drama, but with a series of small disasters that accumulated like storm clouds gathering on a summer afternoon. Laurent, for all his technical skill, lacked the intuitive understanding of his employer's preferences that Maria had developed over 15 years. His artistic vision sometimes clashed with practical considerations, meals that looked stunning but couldn't be kept warm during dinner parties, flavor combinations that impressed food critics but left the Sterling family hungry for something more satisfying. More troubling were the signs that Laurent's ego was beginning to interfere with his professionalism. He chafed at Catherine's suggestions about menu modifications, bristled when Richard requested simpler preparations for casual family dinners, and began to treat the kitchen as his personal domain where others entered only with permission. Maria watched these dynamics develop with the eye of someone who had learned to read the subtle currents of household politics, recognizing the warning signs of conflict that the Sterling family, in their satisfaction with their upgraded cuisine, had not yet noticed. The powder keg finally exploded during the August dinner party that Richard had been anticipating for months. The guest list included some of the most influential figures in the luxury hospitality industry, men whose restaurant investments had made them wealthy, whose opinions could make or break careers, whose approval Richard desperately wanted to secure his place in their exclusive circle. Laurent had planned an elaborate tasting menu that would showcase his most impressive techniques, a culinary performance designed to cement Richard's reputation as a man of sophisticated taste and unlimited resources. But sophisticated food requires sophisticated execution, and Laurent had perhaps overestimated his ability to manage such a complex meal without the kind of experienced support staff that high-end restaurants employed. As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that he was struggling to coordinate all the elements of his ambitious menu. Sauces separated, timing went awry, and the artistic presentations that looked so elegant in theory proved difficult to execute under pressure. Maria watched from her position at the prep station, her experienced eye catching every small disaster as it unfolded. Her instinct was to help, to step in with the kind of practical knowledge that comes from decades of cooking under pressure. But Laurent's pride prevented him from accepting assistance from someone he viewed as merely a kitchen helper. Instead, he became increasingly frantic, his artistic vision colliding with the harsh reality of a dinner party that would begin in 2 hours, whether his molecular foams were properly set or not. As the first guests began to arrive, the kitchen was a barely controlled chaos of last-minute adjustments and desperate improvisations. Laurent, sweating profusely despite the air conditioning, was trying to salvage a sauce that had broken while simultaneously monitoring 6 different cooking processes that all required precise timing. The beautiful presentations he had planned were becoming hasty arrangements as he realized that perfection would have to be sacrificed to get food on the table before the guests began to wonder what was happening in the kitchen. It was during this crisis that the accident occurred, though whether it was truly an accident or the inevitable result of Laurent's frantic state would later be questioned. A bottle of wine, a vintage Bordeaux worth more than Maria's monthly salary, was somehow knocked from the counter and shattered against the marble floor. The wine spread like blood across the white stone, soaking into the spaces between the tiles and filling the kitchen with the sharp scent of alcohol and broken dreams. But worse than the wine was what happened next. In his panic to clean up the mess before anyone noticed, Laurent somehow jostled a platter of delicate appetizers, sending them tumbling to the floor in a cascade of ruined artistry. The sound of breaking china and the sight of food scattered across expensive wine created a scene of destruction that felt like a metaphor for the entire evening's collapse. Laurent stared at the mess with the horrified expression of someone watching his career implode in real time. It was at this moment that Richard chose to check on the kitchen's progress, his own anxiety about the important dinner driving him to personally ensure that everything was proceeding smoothly. He opened the kitchen door to find Laurent standing in the middle of what looked like a war zone, his white chef's coat stained with food and wine, his face ashen with the realization of how badly things had gone wrong. The carefully planned menu was in ruins, the expensive wine was soaking into the floor, and the guests were beginning to ask when dinner would be served. Richard's reaction was immediate and explosive. His face went through a series of changes, confusion, understanding, and finally rage, as the full scope of the disaster became clear. This was the dinner that was supposed to secure his membership in the most exclusive investment circle in the city, the evening that would establish his credibility among men whose good opinion could be worth millions of dollars in future business opportunities. Instead, he was standing in a kitchen that looked like the scene of a catering catastrophe, with a chef who seemed incapable of delivering the sophisticated meal that had been promised. But Richard Sterling had not built a $40 million real estate empire by accepting responsibility for his own poor decisions. In his mind, this disaster needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for the evening's failures, so that his own judgment in hiring Laurent would not be questioned. His eyes swept the kitchen, taking in Laurent's obvious distress, the scattered food, the broken wine bottle, and finally settling on Maria, who stood quietly beside the prep sink, her expression carefully neutral as she watched the scene unfold. The accusation, when it came, was swift and brutal in its unfairness. "This is your fault," Richard snarled, pointing at Maria with a finger that trembled with rage. "You've been undermining him from the beginning, haven't you? Jealous that we found someone better, someone with real training. Did you think sabotaging tonight's dinner would prove something? Show us that we needed you back?" Maria's shock was complete and devastating. She had done nothing but watch Laurent struggle, had offered no interference even when her experience could have prevented the disasters that had unfolded. She had performed her assigned tasks with the same quiet competence she had always shown, had stayed in her designated role even as everything fell apart around her. But now she was being blamed for failures that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with Richard's poor judgment and Laurent's overconfidence. "Mr. Sterling," Maria began, her voice quiet but steady. "Don't," Richard cut her off with a vicious gesture. "I don't want to hear excuses. 15 years, and this is how you repay my family's generosity? By trying to destroy us when we no longer need your services?" The word dripped with contempt, reducing years of dedicated work to something distasteful and disposable. The cruelty of the moment was made worse by its witnesses. Laurent stood silent, neither defending Maria nor accepting responsibility for his own failures. Catherine appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the raised voices, and quickly sized up the situation with the calculating gaze of someone more concerned with social embarrassment than justice. Emma, who had been upstairs getting ready for the dinner that she was finally old enough to attend, heard the commotion and crept down to listen, her young heart breaking as she realized what was happening to the woman who had been more of a mother to her than her own. "I want you gone," Richard continued, his voice growing colder and more final with each word. "Tonight. Pack your things and get out. After everything my family has done for you, this is unconscionable. You're fired, and don't expect any references from us. Who would want to hire someone who sabotages their employers out of petty jealousy?" Maria stood in the center of the kitchen that had been her world for 15 years, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the familiar smells of cooking food, and felt something inside her break that could never be repaired. Not her spirit, that had been battered but never broken by years of small cruelties and casual dismissals. What broke was her faith in the fundamental decency of people, her belief that dedication and service would eventually be recognized and valued. She had given the best years of her life to this family, had nourished them with food prepared with love and care, had been present for birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday nights when her cooking was the only warmth in a cold, beautiful house. The silence that followed Richard's ultimatum stretched like a chasm between past and future, between the woman Maria had been when she walked into this kitchen 15 years ago, full of hope and skill, and the woman she was becoming as she faced the wreckage of her professional life. Around her, the kitchen continued its mechanical functions, the refrigerator humming, the ventilation system removing the last traces of cooking smells, the expensive appliances maintaining their perfect temperatures as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Emma broke first, her young voice cutting through the tension like a cry of pain. "Daddy, no. Maria didn't do anything wrong. She was just standing there. It was—" But Richard silenced his daughter with a look that could have frozen fire, his rage too complete to allow for contradiction or alternative explanations. In his mind, the narrative was already fixed. The jealous cook had sabotaged the sophisticated chef out of spite, and justice demanded her immediate dismissal. Maria looked around the kitchen one last time, her gaze taking in details she had never noticed in 15 years of daily work. The way the afternoon light slanted through the window above the sink, casting geometric shadows on the marble countertop. The small pot of herbs she had been growing on the windowsill, their leaves bright green against the backdrop of Manhattan's glass towers. The wooden spoon she had brought from home years ago, worn smooth by countless stirring motions, hanging now among the expensive utensils Richard had provided. These small personal touches in a room designed for professional efficiency suddenly seemed heartbreakingly out of place. Without a word, Maria untied her apron, not the crisp white one that was part of the Sterling Manor uniform, but the faded blue one her grandmother had sewn by hand, embroidered with small flowers and yellow thread that had dimmed with age and washing. She folded it carefully, her movements deliberate and dignified despite the chaos around her, and tucked it into her purse, along with the wooden spoon and a small photograph that had been taped inside her locker, a picture of herself and Emma from the previous Christmas, both of them laughing as they decorated cookies together. As she walked toward the service entrance for the last time, Maria felt the weight of 15 years settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She thought of all the early mornings when she had unlocked this door in darkness, all the meals she had prepared with love despite receiving no gratitude, all the small moments of joy she had found in nourishing this family that had never truly seen her as anything more than a convenience. The service hallway, which had always felt like a passage between her personal life and her professional purpose, now felt like a corridor leading away from everything she had been and toward an uncertain future. Behind her, she could hear Richard barking instructions at Laurent, could sense Catherine beginning the damage control that would be necessary to salvage the dinner party, could picture Emma standing frozen in the doorway with tears streaming down her young face. but Maria didn't turn back. She had learned long ago that dignity sometimes required walking away from situations that only diminished you further, that there came a moment when self-preservation demanded choosing your own worth over others' comfort. The heavy door of Sterling Manor closed behind Maria with a finality that seemed to echo through the Manhattan streets like a funeral bell. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her small suitcase in one hand and her purse in the other, looking up at the limestone facade that had framed her working life for so many years. The windows of the kitchen, her kitchen, glowed with warm light, and she could see shadows moving behind the glass, Laurent and Richard probably, trying to salvage what they could of the evening's menu. The thought that they would manage without her, that the Sterling family would continue their lives as if 15 years of her service had never existed, created an ache in her chest that felt like physical illness. But even in her pain, Maria could not bring herself to wish them failure. Emma was in that house, sweet Emma who had learned to cook with love rather than technique, who understood that food was a language of caring. Whatever anger Maria felt toward Richard and Catherine, whatever hurt had been inflicted by their casualness about her worth, she could not wish harm on the child who had been her joy, her reminder that her work had meaning beyond the wages she received. The taxi that took Maria back to the Bronx moved through streets that seemed unfamiliar, despite having been her route home for 15 years. Everything looked different when you were seeing it as the end rather than the intermission, when the comfortable rhythm of work and rest was broken, and the future stretched ahead like an unmapped territory. Maria pressed her face against the window and watched the city flow past, the Upper East Side, where wealth lived behind elegant facades, the bridge that connected Manhattan to the outer boroughs, the gradual shift from luxury to necessity that marked the journey from privilege to reality. Her mother's apartment building looked smaller than she remembered, more weathered, though it had been less than a week since her last visit. As Maria climbed the familiar stairs, her suitcase bumping against the narrow walls, she tried to imagine how she would explain what had happened. Her mother, 82 years old and sharp as the kitchen knives she still insisted on using, despite arthritis in her hands, would see through any attempt to soften the blow. She would know immediately that something had gone terribly wrong, and her questions would come from love rather than judgment, making them somehow harder to answer. "Mija," her mother said as soon as she opened the door and saw Maria's face. "¿Qué pasó?" The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of a lifetime's understanding that sometimes people who worked hard and loved deeply were still treated unfairly by a world that valued appearance over substance. That night, as Maria lay in the narrow bed of her childhood room, surrounded by faded photographs and memories of a simpler time, she tried to make sense of what had happened and what would happen next. At 58, she was not old, but she was not young either. Her hands still moved with skill and grace, her palate was as refined as any chef's, and her understanding of how to nourish both body and soul through food remained undiminished. But she was also a woman without formal training, without prestigious references, without the kind of credentials that open doors in a culinary world, increasingly obsessed with celebrity and sophistication. The immediate practical concerns were manageable. Her savings would sustain her for several months, and her mother's apartment offered shelter while she figured out her next step. But the deeper wound, the injury to her sense of self and purpose, would take much longer to heal. Maria had defined herself for 15 years as someone indispensable, as the beating heart of a household that needed her daily care. Learning to see herself as someone worthy of respect regardless of her employment status, someone whose skills had value independent of the Sterling family's recognition, would require a fundamental shift in how she understood her own worth. Meanwhile, miles away in Manhattan, Sterling Manor was discovering what it felt like to function without the steady presence that had sustained it for so many years. Laurent, shaken by the evening's disasters and his employer's explosive reaction, was struggling to establish the kind of routine that made a kitchen function smoothly day after day. He could create spectacular dishes for special occasions, But the mundane work of planning daily menus, managing inventory, and maintaining the consistent quality that a household expected required skills he had never developed in restaurant kitchens where those responsibilities were handled by others. Emma, devastated by Maria's abrupt departure, began to show signs of the loss in ways that worried even her self-absorbed parents. She picked at Laurent's carefully prepared meals, complained of stomach aches, and spent hours in her room rather than seeking out the kitchen warmth that had always been her refuge. Catherine, focused on the social implications of the dinner party disaster and the challenge of finding another suitable chef, dismissed Emma's behavior as adolescent moodiness. But Richard, when he noticed it all, felt a nagging sense that something essential had been lost along with Maria's presence. The house itself seemed different, colder despite the expensive heating system, less welcoming despite the unchanged luxury of its appointments. The kitchen, which had always been filled with the sounds of simmering pots and quiet humming, now operated with professional efficiency, but without the warmth that had made it the emotional center of the home. Laurent's meals were technically superior to anything Maria had ever prepared, but they satisfied only physical hunger, leaving a spiritual emptiness that no one in the Sterling family yet knew how to name. It was Emma who first verbalized what they were all feeling during a family dinner 3 weeks after Maria's dismissal. Laurent had prepared an elaborate seafood course that looked like fine art on the plate, each element carefully positioned to create visual harmony. But as Emma pushed the food around without eating, she looked up at her parents with tears in her eyes. "It doesn't taste like home anymore," she said simply. "Everything is perfect, but nothing feels like it was made for us." Richard and Catherine exchanged glances over their daughter's head, both recognizing a truth they weren't ready to acknowledge. Richard, in particular, felt an uncomfortable stirring of something that might have been regret. The dinner party that had cost him Maria's employment had not, in the end, been the social triumph he had anticipated. The investors had been polite about Laurent's ultimately successful performance, but there had been no immediate offers of partnership, no indication that Richard's culinary sophistication had impressed them enough to include him in their inner circle. The evening that was supposed to validate his decision to upgrade his domestic staff had instead left him questioning whether the cost had been worth the minimal benefit. But pride is a powerful thing, and Richard Sterling had not built his fortune by second-guessing his decisions or admitting mistakes. Instead of confronting the possibility that he had acted hastily and unfairly, he doubled down on his conviction that change had been necessary. He hired a housekeeping service to deep clean the kitchen, ordered new equipment to support Laurent's more complex cooking techniques, and began planning another dinner party that would surely achieve the social success that had eluded the first attempt. Yet, as autumn settled over New York City, painting Central Park in shades of gold and crimson, the Sterling household continued to feel Maria's absence in ways both obvious and subtle. The morning routine, once orchestrated with clockwork precision, had become a series of small inconveniences and missed details. Laurent, talented though he was, lacked Maria's intuitive understanding of family preferences and schedules. Breakfast might be late because he had underestimated the cooking time, or prepared foods that looked impressive but weren't practical for busy weekday mornings. More troubling were the signs that Laurent's ego was making him difficult to manage. He resented Catherine's suggestions about menu modifications, bristled when asked to prepare simpler meals for casual family dinners, and began to treat the kitchen as his personal domain, where family members required permission to enter. The easy warmth that had made the kitchen a gathering place disappeared, replaced by an atmosphere of professional competence that discouraged lingering or casual conversation. Emma, now 14 and increasingly aware of social dynamics, began to understand that her family's treatment of Maria had been not just unkind, but unjust. She started asking questions that her parents found uncomfortable. Why hadn't Maria been given a chance to defend herself? Why had they assumed she was responsible for Laurent's failures? Why hadn't 15 years of faithful service earned her at least the benefit of the doubt? These questions revealed a moral clarity that made Richard and Catherine uncomfortable, forcing them to confront aspects of their behavior they preferred not to examine closely. The truth began to emerge through a series of small revelations that accumulated over the following months. Emma, who had witnessed the kitchen disaster from the hallway, quietly confided to her brother Michael during his Christmas break that Maria had done nothing wrong, that Laurent's struggles had been obvious even to a teenager who knew little about professional cooking. Michael, home from Harvard Business School with a newly developed social conscience, pressed for details and grew increasingly troubled by what he learned. Then came the discovery that would change everything. Emma, cleaning out a drawer in the kitchen island where she had once sat with Maria learning to cook, found a small notebook wedged behind the drawer front. It was one of Maria's recipe collections, not the formal ones she had kept for menu planning, but a personal collection filled with handwritten notes, modifications, and comments that revealed the depth of her knowledge and the care she had put into every meal she prepared. The notebook was a revelation to anyone who took the time to read it carefully. Each recipe was annotated with notes about family preferences, dietary restrictions, seasonal modifications, and personal touches that transformed simple dishes into expressions of care and understanding. "Emma loves when I add extra vanilla to the French toast batter," read one note. "Mr. Sterling's blood pressure means less salt, but lemon juice brightens the flavors without adding sodium. Catherine gets migraines from too much garlic, but shallots give similar flavor without triggering her headaches." Page after page revealed the extent to which Maria had tailored her cooking not just to generic good taste, but to the specific needs, preferences, and health requirements of each family member. She had maintained detailed records of successful dinner parties, noting which dishes had been most popular, which wines had paired well, which guests had specific dietary needs that required special preparation. The notebook was a master class in the kind of personalized service that no culinary school taught, but that could only be developed through years of careful observation and genuine caring. Michael took the notebook to his father, and for the first time since Maria's dismissal, Richard was forced to confront evidence of what he had lost. Here, in Maria's careful handwriting, was proof of the knowledge and dedication that had sustained his household for 15 years. The clinical efficiency of Laurent's cooking suddenly seemed less impressive when compared to the thoughtful personalization that Maria had brought to every meal. The sophisticated techniques that Richard had valued so highly paled beside the evidence of genuine care that filled every page of the notebook. But the most damning revelation came when Emma, emboldened by her brother's support, finally told her parents the complete truth about the night of the dinner party disaster. She described in painful detail how Laurent had struggled throughout the afternoon, how his ambitious menu had overwhelmed his ability to execute it properly, how the broken wine bottle and scattered appetizers had been the result of panic and inexperience rather than sabotage. She forced her parents to confront the reality that Maria had been a scapegoat, blamed for failures that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with their own poor judgment in hiring a chef whose skills didn't match his ambitions. The weight of this truth settled over Richard like a physical burden. He had built his business success on his ability to assess people in situations accurately, to make decisions based on facts rather than emotions. But in Maria's case, he had abandoned these principles, allowing his desire for social advancement to override his judgment, his pride to ignore evidence, his anger to seek easy targets rather than accept responsibility. The realization that he had destroyed the career of a woman who had served his family faithfully for 15 years and done so based on false accusations and scapegoating created a guilt that penetrated even his carefully constructed emotional defenses. Catherine's reaction was different, but equally disturbing. She was less concerned with the moral implications of their actions than with the social embarrassment of having made such a public mistake. The story of Maria's dismissal had spread through their professional network, and Catherine was beginning to hear whispers that suggested some people had been skeptical of the accusations against the longtime cook. Her reputation for good judgment and fair treatment of staff was being questioned, and she realized that the social advancement they had hoped to achieve might be undermined by perceptions that they were unreliable employers who treated loyal staff badly. But it was Emma's ongoing distress that finally forced the family to confront the full cost of their actions. The girl who had once been happy and outgoing had become withdrawn and sad, picking at her food and spending long hours alone in her room. Her grades at school began to slip, and her teachers reported that she seemed distracted and unhappy. When pressed for an explanation, Emma finally broke down and told her parents that she felt guilty every day, that she couldn't enjoy her meals knowing that the woman who had taught her to cook, who had shown her love through food, had been treated so unfairly by her own family. "I dream about her sometimes," Emma said through tears that seemed to come from some deep well of sorrow. "She's standing in our kitchen, but it's empty and cold, and she's looking for her recipes, but she can't find them. And I want to tell her that we're sorry, that we didn't mean it, but she can't hear me. She just keeps looking and looking, and then she walks away, and I wake up feeling like I've lost something important forever." The image of Maria's searching fruitlessly for her recipes in an empty kitchen haunted Richard in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He began to remember details about her work that he had never consciously noticed, the way she had always known exactly how he liked his coffee, the fact that she had somehow managed to have fresh flowers on the kitchen table every week, the careful attention she had paid to creating meals that brought the family together around the table. These memories, viewed through the lens of his newfound understanding of her dedication, created a picture of loss that went far beyond the simple absence of good cooking. Winter deepened, and Laurent's limitations became increasingly apparent. He was a skilled technician, capable of creating impressive dishes for special occasions, but he lacked the intuitive understanding of daily household rhythms that had made Maria irreplaceable. More problematically, his arrogance was beginning to create tensions throughout the household. He clashed with the housekeeping staff, dismissed suggestions from family members, and generally created an atmosphere of professional competition rather than collaborative service. The final straw came during a casual Sunday dinner when Emma asked Laurent if he could prepare one of her favorite dishes, a simple rice and beans combination that Maria had taught her to make. Laurent's response revealed both his culinary snobbery and his fundamental misunderstanding of what cooking meant to the Sterling family. "I don't prepare peasant food," he said with barely concealed disdain. "If you want simple carbohydrates, I suggest you order takeout." Emma's face crumpled as if she had been slapped, and Richard felt something inside him snap. This was his daughter. Distressed and missing someone who had loved her, asking for a simple connection to happier times, and being dismissed by an employee who apparently felt that his culinary training made him superior to the emotional needs of the family that employed him. In that moment, all of Laurent's technical skills became irrelevant beside his complete failure to understand that cooking for a family was about more than impressive presentation and sophisticated techniques. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Richard, finally acknowledging the depth of his mistake in hiring Laurent and firing Maria, dismissed the young chef with an efficiency that reflected months of accumulated frustration. Laurent's shocked protests about the unfairness of his dismissal were met with cold silence from an employer who had learned too late the difference between technical skill and genuine value. But firing Laurent was the easy part. Finding Maria and making amends for the injustice she had suffered would prove far more challenging. Richard's initial efforts to locate her were frustrated by the discovery that she had seemingly disappeared from their mutual professional networks. Her former colleagues knew nothing about her current employment, and the address they had on file was her mother's apartment, where an elderly woman answered the phone with suspicion when asked about Maria's whereabouts. Emma, devastated by the failure to reconnect with the woman who had meant so much to her, began her own investigation. Using social media and online resources with the skill that came naturally to her generation, she slowly pieced together clues about Maria's life since leaving Sterling Manor. The trail led eventually to Queens, to a community kitchen that served meals to families struggling with poverty and food insecurity. It was there, in a setting very different from the luxury of Manhattan, that the Sterling family would finally find the woman they had so grievously wronged. The community kitchen operated out of a church basement, a humble space that couldn't have been more different from the gleaming efficiency of Sterling Manor's high-end kitchen. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on linoleum floors and metal tables that had seen decades of use. The equipment was basic and well-worn, the kind of functional but modest appliances that non-profit organizations acquired through donations and careful budgeting. But the air was filled with aromas that spoke of love and care, the kind of cooking that prioritized nourishment over presentation, substance over style. It was here that Maria had found her purpose renewed, her skills valued not for their sophistication, but for their ability to transform simple ingredients into meals that fed both body and soul. She worked alongside other volunteers, many of them women who had faced their own struggles with employment discrimination and economic hardship. Together, they created an atmosphere of mutual support and shared purpose that had been absent from Maria's life during her final years at Sterling Manor. The work was physically demanding and emotionally rewarding in ways that her previous job had never been. Each day brought families who arrived with the particular combination of pride and need that marked people who were struggling but not beaten, who accepted help with grace while maintaining their dignity. Children who reminded her of Emma at various ages would linger in the serving area, drawn by the warmth and kindness that Maria radiated as naturally as heat from a well-tended fire. Maria's reputation in this community had grown organically, based not on credentials or formal recognition, but on the simple evidence that she could take donated ingredients of varying quality and turn them into meals that people actually wanted to eat. Her ability to stretch budgets while maintaining flavor, to accommodate dietary restrictions with creativity rather than complaint, and to infuse even the most basic preparations with a sense of care and attention had made her invaluable to the program's mission. But more than her technical skills, it was Maria's understanding of what food meant to people that made her irreplaceable in this setting. She knew instinctively which families were newcomers to food assistance programs and might need extra gentleness to preserve their dignity. She could spot a child who wasn't getting enough nutrition at home and would quietly prepare an extra portion with protein-rich ingredients. She understood that sometimes people needed to talk while they ate, and sometimes they needed to be left alone with their thoughts, and she had developed an intuition for which approach would best serve each individual's emotional needs. It was in this environment, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could do for their social status, that Maria had begun to heal from the wounds inflicted by her dismissal from Sterling Manor. The work paid modestly, barely enough to cover her basic expenses, but it provided something that her previous job had never offered, a sense that her contributions were appreciated, that her presence made a meaningful difference in people's lives, that her skills were being used in service of something larger than personal convenience or social advancement. When Richard Sterling walked into the community kitchen on a cold February afternoon, carrying Emma's notebook of Maria's recipes and a carefully rehearsed apology, he was unprepared for what he found. The woman he had dismissed as inadequately trained was clearly the emotional and practical center of an operation that fed hundreds of people each week. Her colleagues deferred to her judgment on menu planning. Families greeted her by name with genuine warmth, and children who should have been shy around strangers seemed drawn to her quiet kindness, like plants turning toward sunlight. Maria looked up from the large pot she was stirring and saw Richard standing uncertainly in the doorway, his expensive overcoat and Italian shoes making him stand out like a peacock among sparrows. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them with unspoken questions and unresolved pain. The other volunteers and visitors in the kitchen seemed to sense the tension. Conversations growing quieter as people tried to understand what was happening. The conversation that followed was neither easy nor quick. Richard had prepared a speech about mistakes and misunderstandings, about his desire to make amends and offer Maria her job back, about financial compensation for the injustice she had suffered. But faced with the reality of Maria in her new environment, surrounded by people who clearly valued and respected her, his prepared words felt inadequate and somehow beside the point. Maria listened with the patience she had learned through years of being dismissed and overlooked, but her response revealed how much she had changed during her months away from Sterling Manor. She was no longer the woman who had accepted criticism silently, who had measured her worth by her employer's approval, who had been willing to endure disrespect for the security of steady employment. The woman who spoke to Richard that afternoon had learned to value herself independently of others' recognition, had discovered work that fulfilled her sense of purpose rather than simply paying her bills, had found a community where her contributions were appreciated and her dignity was never questioned. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there during her years of service in his household. "I appreciate your coming here, and I understand that you've realized you made a mistake that night. But I need you to understand something too. I don't need your job anymore. I have work that matters, work where I'm valued for who I am, not just what I can do for someone else's convenience." The rejection stung Richard with unexpected force. He had assumed that offering to restore Maria's position, along with appropriate financial compensation, would be enough to repair the damage he had done. The possibility that she might no longer want what he was offering had not occurred to him, and he found himself struggling with the unfamiliar experience of having his generosity refused by someone he had always seen as dependent on his goodwill. But Emma, who had insisted on accompanying her father on this mission of reconciliation, understood something that Richard had missed. This wasn't about employment or financial security. It was about respect, about recognition, about acknowledging that Maria's skills and dedication had value that went beyond what any employer could pay. Emma stepped forward with the notebook she had been clutching throughout the conversation, offering it to Maria like a peace offering that represented more than just returned property. "We found this in the kitchen," Emma said, her young voice thick with unshed tears. "All your recipes, all your notes about what we liked and what made us happy. I've been trying to cook some of them, but they don't taste right when I make them. It's like they need you to make them complete." She paused, struggling with emotions that were too big for her 14-year-old heart to contain easily. "I miss you. I miss the way the kitchen felt when you were there. I miss learning from you. I miss feeling like our house was a home." Maria took the notebook with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing the worn cover and familiar weight of something she had never expected to see again. Opening it revealed pages of her own handwriting, recipes refined over years of cooking for the Sterling family, notes about preferences and adjustments, reminders about seasonal variations and special occasions. It was like holding a piece of her own history, a record of dedication and care that she had thought was lost forever. For the first time since their conversation began, Maria's composure wavered. This notebook represented 15 years of accumulated knowledge about one family's needs and preferences, 15 years of paying attention to details that no one else had noticed or valued. Seeing her careful notes about Emma's preferences, her adjustments for Richard's health concerns, her accommodations for Catherine's dietary restrictions, brought back memories of a time when her work had felt meaningful despite the lack of recognition. But it also reminded her of how easily all of that dedication had been dismissed, how quickly 15 years of faithful service had been forgotten in a moment of crisis. The notebook was precious to her, but accepting it back felt like accepting the narrative that her true value lay in her ability to serve the Sterling family rather than in her inherent worth as a skilled professional and caring human being. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Richard gradually beginning to understand that the issue was not simply about material compensation or professional reconciliation. Maria had been wounded not just by losing her job, but by the manner of her dismissal, by the assumptions that had been made about her character, by the complete absence of trust or benefit of doubt after 15 years of faithful service. The healing she needed could not be provided by simply restoring what had been taken away. Emma, with the emotional intelligence that often comes more naturally to children than to adults, finally asked the question that addressed the heart of the matter. What would it take for you to forgive us? Not to come back and work for us, but just to forgive us for how we treated you? Maria was quiet for a long moment, looking around the community kitchen where she had found purpose and respect, then back at Emma's earnest face and Richard's uncomfortable but genuine remorse. When she spoke, her answer revealed both the depth of her hurt and the generosity of her spirit. Forgiveness isn't something you can buy or negotiate, she said gently. It's something that happens when people understand what they've done wrong and why it mattered, when they've learned something that makes them less likely to hurt someone else the same way. She looked directly at Richard as she continued. I can see that you know you made a mistake, but I'm not sure you understand why it was so painful. It wasn't just about losing my job. It was about being treated like my 15 years of caring for your family meant nothing, like I was so untrustworthy that you wouldn't even listen to my side of the story. Richard shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the truth in her words. His business success had accustomed him to measuring relationships in terms of contracts and compensation, to believing that problems could be solved through financial solutions and professional arrangements. But Maria was describing a kind of damage that couldn't be repaired through monetary means, a wound to dignity and respect that required a different kind of healing. I want you to know, Richard said finally, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of humility, that I've learned from this experience, not just about you, but about how I treat people who work for me, about the assumptions I make, about the importance of listening before making judgments. What I did to you was wrong, and it's changed how I think about my responsibilities as an employer and as a human being. The words were clumsy, delivered with the awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to admitting error, but they carried a sincerity that Maria could recognize. She had spent enough years reading the emotional climate of the Sterling household to distinguish between genuine remorse and mere social convenience. This was painful for Richard in ways that went beyond social embarrassment or professional inconvenience, and that pain was perhaps the beginning of real understanding. The resolution, when it came, was not what anyone had expected, but felt right in ways that more conventional solutions would not have. Maria agreed to return to Sterling Manor, not as an employee, but as a consultant and teacher. She would help them find and train a new cook who could provide both the technical skills they needed and the personal attention their family required. More importantly, she would work with Emma to preserve and pass on the knowledge contained in her notebooks, ensuring that the girls' education in cooking would continue with proper respect for both technique and tradition. The arrangement allowed everyone to maintain their dignity while acknowledging what had been lost and found. Richard got the chance to demonstrate that he had learned from his mistakes without simply trying to restore the previous status quo. Emma got the opportunity to continue learning from someone she deeply respected, and Maria got recognition for her expertise while maintaining the independence and self-respect she discovered in her work at the community kitchen. The first time Maria walked back into the Sterling Manor kitchen 6 months after her dismissal, the space felt both familiar and strange. The expensive equipment was the same, the marble countertops gleamed with the same cold perfection, but the atmosphere was different. There was a humility there that hadn't existed before, a recognition that creating a home required more than just sophisticated cooking techniques or impressive presentation. Emma was waiting for her, older now and more serious, but with the same eager curiosity that had made her such a joy to teach years earlier. Together, they began the patient work of documenting recipes and techniques, of preserving not just the mechanical aspects of cooking, but the emotional intelligence that transformed mere food preparation into genuine nourishment. Maria shared stories about the dishes they prepared, where she had learned each technique how she had adapted traditional recipes to suit the Sterling family's preferences, why certain flavor combinations worked better for daily meals than for special occasions. But the lessons went beyond cooking. Emma learned about dignity in work, about the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their job titles or educational credentials, about the ways that power could corrupt judgment if not exercised with constant awareness of its effects on others. She learned that apologies meant nothing without changed behavior, that trust once broken required patient rebuilding, that some wounds to the spirit took much longer to heal than anyone expected. Richard, too, found himself learning lessons he had never anticipated needing. Watching Maria work with his daughter, seeing the expertise and care she brought to every aspect of food preparation, forced him to confront how much he had taken for granted during her years of service. The casual dismissal of her work as just cooking, the assumption that her lack of formal training made her less valuable than someone with impressive credentials, the willingness to blame her when things went wrong without considering alternative explanations, all of these attitudes now seemed not just wrong, but actively harmful. The new cook they eventually hired was technically skilled and professionally trained, but her employment came with explicit expectations about respect and communication that reflected the Sterling family's hard-won understanding of what had gone wrong before. Maria worked with her for several weeks, sharing not just recipes but insights about family preferences, seasonal planning, and the dozens of small details that made the difference between competent cooking and genuine care. As the arrangement evolved, something unexpected happened. The Sterling family began spending more time in the kitchen, drawn by the warmth and activity that surrounded Maria's teaching sessions with Emma. Richard found himself lingering over morning coffee, listening to conversations about food and family that reminded him of aspects of life he'd forgotten in his focus on business success. Catherine, initially uncomfortable with the changed dynamics, gradually began to appreciate the gentler atmosphere that replaced the tension that had marked Laurent's brief tenure. The community kitchen in Queens continued to benefit from Maria's expertise as well. Richard, his perspective altered by his glimpse into that world, began providing financial support that allowed the program to expand its services and improve its facilities. Emma volunteered there on weekends, learning about food insecurity and social service while practicing the cooking skills Maria had taught her. The connection between the Sterling family's privileged world and the broader community they inhabited became a bridge that enriched everyone involved. Time passed, and the notebook that had been the catalyst for their reconciliation became the foundation for something larger. Maria and Emma collaborated on organizing the recipes and stories into a more comprehensive collection that captured not just cooking techniques, but the cultural knowledge and family wisdom that informed them. The project grew into a cookbook that celebrated the kind of everyday cooking that nourished families and communities, the recipes passed down through generations of women who understood that food was love made visible. The cookbook found an audience among readers who were hungry for authenticity in a culinary world increasingly dominated by celebrity chefs and complex techniques. Maria's story, told simply and without self-pity, resonated with people who had felt invisible in their own work, who had given generously without receiving recognition, who had wondered if their contributions mattered in a world that seemed to value credentials over character. The success of the book surprised everyone involved, but it felt like appropriate recognition for knowledge and skill that had always deserved a wider audience. Yet for all the public recognition that eventually came, the most meaningful outcome was the restoration of relationships and the healing of wounds that had seemed irreparable. Emma grew into a young woman who understood both the privilege of her position and her responsibility to use that privilege thoughtfully. She carried with her the lessons Maria had taught her about respect, dignity, and the importance of seeing value in all honest work. Richard's business practices evolved to reflect his changed understanding of employer responsibilities and human worth. The real estate empire he continued to build operated with employment policies that emphasized respect and communication, that valued loyalty and dedication alongside technical competence. His success, which had always been measured in dollars and properties, now included metrics of employee satisfaction and community contribution that would have seemed irrelevant to his younger self. The Sterling Manor kitchen became a different kind of place, still efficient and well-equipped, but warm in ways it had never been before. The new cook, trained by Maria and supported by a family that had learned to appreciate, rather than simply expect, good service, created meals that satisfied both physical hunger and emotional needs. The family gathered around the table more often, their conversations enriched by an understanding of how much care had gone into preparing their food. And Maria, the woman whose quiet service had sustained a household for 15 years, had found something she had never thought to seek: recognition not just for her skills, but for her worth as a human being. The community kitchen continued to be her primary work, and the satisfaction she found there remained undiminished by any other success. But the knowledge that her expertise was valued, that her story had helped other people understand the dignity inherent in all honest work, that the young woman she had helped raise would carry forward lessons about respect and appreciation. These gifts felt like the completion of a circle that had been broken but was now made whole. The notebooks that had documented 15 years of caring service now represented something more: a bridge between generations, a record of wisdom earned through daily practice, a testament to the idea that love expressed through cooking was both art and service, both personal gift and professional skill. In preserving and sharing this knowledge, Maria had transformed her personal experience of injustice into a broader statement about the value of work that nourishes both body and spirit. On the 5th anniversary of her dismissal from Sterling Manor, Maria stood in her kitchen at the community center, preparing lunch for families who would arrive hungry and leave satisfied. The work remained challenging and modestly paid, but it was work that aligned with her values and utilized her skills in service of people who genuinely needed what she could provide. Around her, volunteers who had learned from her example prepared foods with the same attention to both nutrition and dignity that she had modeled. Emma, now preparing for college, spent her afternoon at the community kitchen as well. At 19, she had grown into someone who understood that privilege came with responsibilities, that knowledge gained in comfort could and should be shared with those facing difficulties. She moved through the kitchen with confidence born of years of patient instruction, her hands skilled in techniques that honored both tradition and adaptation, her heart guided by lessons about service that went far beyond cooking. The relationship between the Sterling family and Maria had evolved into something that transcended the boundaries of employer and employee, teacher and student, forgiver and forgiven. It had become an example of how damage could be repaired when people were willing to acknowledge their mistakes, learn from their errors, and commit to doing better in the future. The process had been neither quick nor easy, but it had produced growth and understanding that enriched everyone involved. As Maria ladled soup into bowls for families whose faces reflected the particular mixture of pride and need that she knew so well, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain of her dismissal had never entirely disappeared, but it had been transformed into wisdom about her own worth and strength. The skills she had always possessed had found new venues for expression and appreciation. The knowledge she had accumulated over decades of cooking with love had become a legacy that would influence how others understood food, service, and human dignity. The Sterling family's learning continued as well. Richard's business empire had grown not just in size, but in its positive impact on communities and employees. Catherine had developed a more conscious awareness of how her actions affected others, particularly those who served her family. Emma carried forward lessons about respect and appreciation that would influence how she treated everyone she encountered throughout her life. The cookbook that had grown from Maria's notebooks continued to find readers who were hungry for authentic stories about food and family, work and worth. But more important than any public recognition was the private satisfaction of knowing that hard-won lessons about dignity and respect had been shared in ways that might prevent others from experiencing the pain of being dismissed and diminished. The community kitchen filled with the familiar sounds of people gathering for a shared meal. Conversations in multiple languages, children's laughter, the clink of serving spoons against metal bowls. Maria smiled as she watched Emma help a shy child choose which vegetables she wanted with her meal. Remembering the curious girl who had learned to cook with love rather than technique, who had grown into a young woman who understood that nourishing others was both privilege and responsibility. And you, have you ever worked for someone who never said thank you, who took your dedication for granted, who made assumptions about your worth based on their own limited understanding? Have you ever felt invisible despite being essential, overlooked despite being indispensable, dismissed despite being devoted? If this story has touched your heart, if you see yourself in Maria's quiet dignity or Emma's loving appreciation, please share it with someone who might need to hear these truths about work and worth, service, and respect. Tell me in the comments about a time when someone appreciated your hard work, or when you learned to value someone whose contributions you had previously taken for granted. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe so these messages of hope and healing can reach others who need to hear them. For more stories about finding dignity in difficult circumstances and discovering strength through service, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the ups and downs of human relationships, through the pain of injustice and the healing power of understanding, through the daily work of creating homes and the lifetime work of building character. Until we meet again in another story that celebrates the best of human nature and the possibility of redemption, remember that every person who serves others with genuine care deserves recognition, respect, and appreciation. We'll see you in the next story.